how do we preserve academic standards under the kind of cost-cutting pressure that we've talked about? Digitising classes, expanding globally, outsourcing courses and education. These are things I write about all the time. For me, it's like being in a sort of candy store of ideas, but I know that many of my friends in academia view what I write about with absolute horror and think that it undermines something. So I guess I'd like to discuss how much we can square that circle here today. Ben, we'll start with you in the Minerva Project. Tell us about how the idea of the university, which I think is still very core to your thinking, can be invented in the model that you're using.
Well, what we're trying to do at Minerva is to rebalance the focus of a university to be student-centered. So the first university in the Western world in Bologna was actually started by students. Students selected the faculty, they evaluated them, they paid for their instruction. And a few years later, in England and in France, the church and the government, or the government and the church respectively, set up a faculty-centered university. And that model came to dominate. But the problem with that model is that a faculty-centered university is centered on the faculty. The university rotates around preserving and promoting their needs. And even though faculty needs are important, when it comes to the concept of the student paying for their education, rebalancing that model back to serve the student is important. And when you do that, a number of things can come out of the university cost model, which are now, at least in the United States, are taken for granted. So for example, the concept that colleges and universities should be participating in an amenities race. I have a beautiful statue in my quad, and so University X will have to have an even nicer statue. I have a great climbing wall, so the other one has to have a simulated tide pool and wave machine, or what have you. The concept that undergraduates should actually pay with their tuition to subsidize faculty research. Which is not done anywhere else in the world, and is really a bizarre outcome of the funding models of American higher education. The concept that tenure protects and inflates salaries for a very small number of faculty and causes a large problem with adjuncts beyond that. The idea that there should be college-level sports, which can cost upwards of $10,000 per student per year, not for those that participate in the sports, but for all students at universities. And finally, the concept that it is okay to bloat the administrative overhead of the university far beyond the rate of increased costs elsewhere. And that's true both because of regulatory, but also some self-imposed concerns. So what we're trying to do at Minerva is effectively change that entire equation and take out those costs that don't contribute to the student outcomes, and instead focus our efforts on the opposite, which is having fully active learning seminars. All of our courses are capped at 19 students per class. Everything is extremely high touch. The selection criteria is both extremely demanding but also completely open, such that we don't discriminate versus from one country to another, et cetera.
Just remind us how long you've been running this.
So Minerva, I started working on Minerva about 4 years ago, and our very first class started earlier this month.
Right, so your first group of students started this month. And they spend their first year actually in a physical environment. They get to know each other.
Yeah, well,
they get to have the frat parties.
Yeah, well, hopefully not frat parties, but they get to have a good time. So our students are actually residential across all 4 years. They spend their first year in San Francisco, and then they break into cohorts. They will break into cohorts of 150 students, and that cohort will then live in 6 different global capitals over the next 6 semesters. And so the idea is the way you get around the concept of having to build a campus is that you use the campus of the world. You use the great cities, the great cultural, political, and economic capitals to provide that kind of experience for students without having to burden them with a cost.
Doug, I think it would be fair to say that you do use the great campus of the world. Just look, you have 75 institutions in 29 countries, 900,000 students. What's the guiding principle of this model?
Well, it's interesting. Many of the things that Ben mentioned were the same driving ideas behind our formation. We're in our 15th year. And 15 years ago, the idea was not only to create universities focused on the student, linked deeply with employers. This was, I think, one other very important dimension on our side, because Ben's aiming at a little bit more of an elite level of student. We're looking at to be a university at various levels, serving various strata of society, but not at the elite level. And so we wanted to build a university around the needs of the student and around needs of employers. We wanted accountability. We wanted to be sure that everyone in our university would have the same responsibility for assuring outcomes and employment for our students. And those were the guiding principles when we started. And we wanted to then have multiple universities, each rooted in their local country. So in Spain, we are a Spanish university. We follow Spanish regulations, and we grant a Spanish degree. In Mexico, a Mexican degree. In Peru, a Peruvian degree. But then we wove...
So is the course pretty much the same than were I to pitch up in Spain and go to one of your universities? Or how much does everything then vary depending on the territory you're in? And how do you get any kind of consistency into the model?
It's a great question. You know, initially we were less focused on consistency and more focused on being successful in each location. And I think that actually made us very attentive to what's needed in each market. So in some markets, there was a great need for working adult programs for students greater than 25 years of age. In some markets, our first market was Spain. We looked in Spain 15 years ago, we could see the demographic trends meant that there would be many fewer 18-year-olds today than there were 15 years ago. So we built a university focused on the health sciences, which we knew an aging society would result in a greater employment opportunity for students in the health sciences, and as a result, that university was very successful and became the largest private university in that country of Spain. So by tuning our offer to the needs of each market, we were able to be successful. But then we wove the universities together in a network in which best practices can be shared. So we have 200 campuses, for example. We have a best practice for campus design, for efficiency, for safety and security, and for student satisfaction. When you've done it 200 times, you can actually get to be good at it. We have 21 medical schools. That's an example where there's consistency. We use a consistent, extremely rigorous medical curriculum. We use the same technology. We use simulations instead of human remains and all sorts of other things that we believe would be cutting edge.
And just briefly, how does this impact fee structure, cost in comparison to other terrestrial models that people will be familiar with?
Well, in this case, the market speaks. So we're mostly in markets that don't have student loans. And I think we all recognize that the student loan offer in the United States is both what has created such an extraordinary dividend for society in so many ways, but also has made it possible for costs to become so inflated. So in our markets, places like Turkey and China and India and Mexico, we just have an absolute limit as to what we know a student could pay. And that limit depends also on the size you wish to have. So if you want to charge $10,000 in Mexico, you're not going to, if you were wildly successful, you might be able to get to 5,000 to 10,000 students. If you're going to charge $5,000, you might be able to get to 100,000 students. And so we figure out what the market would expect and support, and then we engineer a solution, a product to meet the needs of that market.
Ben, Minerva's offering your product at $10,000 a year right now, which obviously is vastly underneath the fee level at elite institutions. So would people be wrong to put a skeptical question, how come you're so cheap? It can't be that good.
Well, it's exactly for the reasons I said earlier, that if you look at the cost structure of a traditional university and you look at the tuition less the amount of a portion of that tuition that is paid for faculty for the time that they teach you and everything associated with the instruction, the overhead, et cetera, just associated with the instruction, you're looking at 80% of your tuition dollars left over. And that's across the board in private, public, nonprofit, for-profit, et cetera. And so what happens is that when you remove the costs associated with the rest of it, you can actually increase the amount that you spend on students, again, by, for example, banning lectures. So at Minerva, we don't recognize any introductory level courses for credit. We don't offer them because they're free. Right? They can be, you'll hear from Anant and from Rick later on today, and they'll tell you all about how you can disseminate knowledge effectively. And so we go beyond that, and we focus only on the seminar experience.
We've seen some variable results, it must be said, from the early MOOCs in terms of quality, outcome, and also student engagement and how encouraged or otherwise students feel throughout their course and supported. Does that not worry you that you're relying very heavily on a digital experience, which is, you don't look at all worried. So
this is where I get to defend.
This
is where I get to defend technology education, which we do not do ourselves, but we absolutely are believers in. And another person who you will hear from later today, Michael Staten, who really is one of the most acute analysts of higher education, puts the analogy correctly. Which is that if you have to think about MOOCs like thinking about books. I'll make this a little bit interactive, a little bit Minerva. How many of you in this audience buy books? Raise your hands, it's okay. Great. Now, how many of you have read every single book that you've ever bought? None of you.
I thought there was going to be one person.
No, none of you. Let the record state that was a 100% to 0% transition. Right. And now, what happens if those books you didn't even have to pay for? How many of them would you even open? Then how many of them would you read the first chapter of and say, you know what, I got to finish this one just because I started it? Well, that's what MOOCs are, right? They're providing information to the world, right? And so when you have that paradigm, of course people are going to sign up and then never show up. Of course, they're going to sit in the first class and not do anything because they realize that they know nothing about thermodynamics and they thought they were interested in it. Turns out they're not, right? And so when you have no incentive, when you're doing it for pleasure. But when you look at those individuals who've gone through the beginning parts and have submitted an assignment, you have a 70% completion rate. 70%. Most universities in the country, 95% of universities in the country, have a worse completion rate than that. So I would be staunch defenders of what they do.
Can I just take that one level further? I agree with everything you just said. I think the analogy is very apt, and I'm a big supporter of the MOOCs, and actually Laureate's an investor in Coursera. But in this case, I think it's important to note there's a reason why books were never the main way that people learned in higher education. If you give someone a stack of books and say, okay, I'll come back in a year and I'll let you operate on me, that is just not going to happen. There's a lot of support. I think one of the things when people talk about the end of the degree, because most of our work is undergraduate students, and while we do a lot of online instruction, a lot of our work is physical, is face-to-face. I think you said terrestrial, which I'm thinking of what the alternative to terrestrial is, getting very excited about that.
Starship Galactica.
Exactly. But in
you know what I mean? A physical, base around which you operate as opposed to a kind of global or a blended model.
But when you think about, and I ask our own people this, what is encompassed in a degree? And in our case, let's say in a place like Mexico, parents are paying for a safe place for their kids to go during the day. They're hoping, and parents and students are hoping that they will get a social network, a professional network, exposure and guidance on what career to select, maybe an internship opportunity. You could go down the list of the things that you get that are encompassed in that degree. And by the way, not everybody needs all of that. And the ability to unbundle that and say, you can get just this piece at this price. I think that's where some of the scale and some of the choices for students in the future will come.
That unbundling idea, obviously very close to your heart at Minerva. It's an interesting mixture to me because you're very much taking on a sort of global role. You said, I think particularly the cities that you've chosen tend to be emerging economies as well as the sort of the grand tour. Right. So you don't want them just going around looking at Canalettos. On the other hand, there's a sort of perception that they're going to be tied to the computer screen, so that basically wherever you send them, they're going to be down at Starbucks, sitting there on the screen. How do you combine this global aspiration that you really want them to go out there, discover the world, be global citizens, able to go and do business in Mumbai as well as sit in the Starbucks watching a bit of YouTube with this low-cost quality model?
Yeah, so it actually goes hand in hand because when you build infrastructure, you have an incentive to utilize it, right? And therefore, you have incentive to keep your students away from the vibrant elements of the world. When you don't build infrastructure, you have an incentive to utilize what's out there. And so not only, so yes, our seminar environment is done in these live interactive seminars that we've built ourselves. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you see the sample on our website at minerva.kgi.edu, so you can actually get a sense of why it is a far more intense learning experience than even gathering students around a table. But you're only in class 13 hours a week. That's nothing. I mean, most of you guys probably spend 13 hours a day in front of a computer. And so the idea is that in the hours that you're not in a formal learning environment, we have a series of extracurricular and co-curricular activities that integrate you into those cities. So our classes are concentrated on Monday to Thursday, which is both because of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday being holy days for various segments of the world population, but also to allow for a 3-day weekend and to allow for students to truly take advantage of wherever they are.
How difficult have you found it, Doug, to get that? You talked earlier about how you use this sort of scale and the amount of diversity within the system also to drive a kind of consistent quality. If you're being sort of ruthlessly frank here, you know, there's no one listening, what would you say the real difficulties of that had been in practice? The theory sounds great, the practice sounds incredibly difficult to manage.
Well, it is difficult. It's difficult, I think, not just for us with 75 universities, but for each individual university. They have many classrooms, and in those many classrooms, they have many professors, and they're not all equally good. And
exactly. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the underperformer when you've got such a big model?
Well, when we know about it, and I think we have a lot of feedback mechanisms to know about it, they don't teach for us anymore. So this is a great example where I think it's very important to maintain a level of flexibility. There are a lot of people that associate the use of part-time faculty with low quality. And I think that's because, especially in the United States, there are faculty members who teach part-time for many universities, and that is their full-time job. And some of them could be perceived as that they couldn't have been hired by one university in a traditional position. But outside of the United States, part-time faculty often connotes a practitioner. So if you have an architect who will teach an architecture class, that is a really important and successful model. And that means that the student has a much better chance of getting an internship and a job and practical experience.
Brings us to our skills gap point rather neatly, doesn't it? That may not be such a bad thing.
It isn't. It isn't.
You want to find out the state of the architecture market in your local area or a particular point that person is good at.
Yes, and yet you'll find that there are countries that mandate the percentage of full-time lecturers, which automatically puts you in a different position. But I think that use of part-time faculty, if we find someone who's not doing a good job, they just don't teach for us anymore.
Well, that sounds pretty simple and brutal. Right, let's get some questions then. We'll take a few in a group because we're running down on the clock. Yeah, we'll take anyone who's got a hand up with the first microphone that gets to it.
That's the market at work.
That's Darwin. Right, off you go.
Hello, I'm Colin Potts. I'm at Georgia Tech. And if I were 18, I wish I were a Minerva student.
Thank you.
But I'm not. And I wonder...
we don't discriminate on age.
Well, okay, I'll give you my card. I get the idea that we don't need necessarily the climbing walls and the coffee bars and so on because they're part of the infrastructure. But what about the wind tunnels and the chemistry labs and these kinds of things? Somebody is paying for those.
Right, just hold your answer because I'm really keen to we're going to have a really sort of quick fire round and pointed answers. Yeah. So we had another hand up here. The gentleman, sorry, just at the front, just where you walked away from the other way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish I could be 18 and at Minerva, but I think from stuff that I read, I couldn't get in to Minerva because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but probably so you want to be more selective, I think, than Harvard in the type of students that go in, which probably will mean that you'll be successful just on the selection bias. And I think the opposite happens to Laureate. You know, I'm from Mexico, I know some of the universities there. I think the perception is not that the faculty members are not good, but you're not selecting students at all. Anybody that applies gets in. So how do you sort of balance the two?
I think in our case, we start with basic standards. So students have to have graduated in good standing from high school, and then we apply additional selection as we think is appropriate. And we have different levels of universities. We have universities that accept 10% of their applicants, and we have universities that accept 90% of their applicants. In a place like Mexico, we have an access mission. We think that if you want to go to a great selective university like the Tech or Ibero or Anahuac, you have plenty of choices in your country. And if you're really elite and wealthy, you may be able to come to Harvard or Stanford or Minerva. But there are many, many people who will make up the productive workforce of the future who should be able to come into a university, learn skills, and go out and get a good job with those skills. And that's the mission, that's our access mission, and that's what we're doing in a country like Mexico.
Ben, we all wish we were 18. What about this, you know, who are you looking for? Are these the kind of, oops, just missed the Ivy League bunch, or is it a little more sophisticated than that?
It's actually people who've, in many senses, that got into the Ivy League, but in other senses, they're people who are excluded from the Ivy League. And so, you know, yes, we are twice as selective as any other elite university, at least in the United States. We had a 2.8% admissions rate. However, our selection criteria is fully non-discriminatory, unlike any other institution in the United States or anywhere in the world. So, fact of the matter is, more than 80% of our students are non-American. That does not happen anywhere else. We don't advantage anything related to wealth. And that doesn't just mean that we're need blind. We also don't look at SAT scores. We don't have pre-written essays, right, that advantage wealthy students versus middle class or poor students. And so, yes, we are looking for the highest potential human caliber on the planet, but we will wind up selecting students that are excluded from the existing infrastructure. And just a word about the research.
Very briefly.
We fully believe in the importance of research and labs, et cetera. We just don't believe that 17-year-olds should be paying the cost of those things. We believe in the European model. It is the responsibility of government. It is the responsibility of philanthropy. It is not appropriate to increase the cost of tuition to subsidize the cost of research.
I'm just conscious that the clock seems to sort of race forward in a slightly spooky way up here. Is there any question that you would just feel, you know, you would be very, very badly shortchanged if you didn't squeak in the last minute? Or would we be happy to sort of take them up perhaps into another session? Yes, a brief one if you could.
Hello, my name is Vineet Teenza, and I'm from the Mountbatten Institute. My question is to you. I really like the idea that how you get rid of the professors who do not get a good feedback and you replace them, just to make sure that everyone has the best learning experience. But of course, there's some professors who are excellent, and they have comparative, cutting-edge ideas that students learn from them. But then there's professors who are okay, but they're not necessarily getting the best feedback. Now, how do you draw a balance there? Because there are one set of students who are going to come out from a class that they're excellent, and another set of students who are going to come out from being taught by a professor who is just okay.
Yes, well, a very good question, actually. It's easy to spot, or relatively easy to spot failures, it's easy to applaud successes, and in a record amount of short time. How do we deal with the soggy middle, the mediocre middle?
I think in our case, actually, there's development for faculty. We actually have a multi-million-dollar budget for development of faculty, and we use technology to train faculty. There's no reason why an acceptable faculty member couldn't become very good. They may not become the best, the greatest. And in any university, you will always have a difference between the worst and the best. And our job should be to work from the bottom up and to narrow that gap as much as we can.